أهلا وسهلا في نيو أورلينز. أرحب بكم في الاجتماع 108 للجمعية الوطنية للتواصل. أتمنى أن تستمتعوا في الجلسات العلمية والعملية هذا الأسبوع. كما أتمنى أن تتوسع إيفاق تفكيرنا سوياً وشبكات تواصلنا جميعاً. Welcome to New Orleans. I welcome you to the 108th Annual National Communication Association Convention. I hope you enjoy both the scholarly and practice-based sessions this week, and that we all take part in knowledge and community expansion together. I also want to acknowledge that the land currently known as New Orleans is physically situated in the region known as Bulbancha, a Choctaw term meaning place of many tongues. I'm Walid Afifi. I'm the first vice president of National Communication Association. I want to take a minute before I briefly discuss the panel to really thank Kristen Yednock for all the incredible work. Kristen is the director of conventions at NCA, and you would not imagine the layers and layers and layers and the hundreds and hundreds of hours that she put, not only leading up, but currently as there are hundreds and hundreds of panels. So behind every person behind the mic taking credit for leadership, there are hundreds of people behind that person doing the work that really gets us here. Kristen does the work of most of those hundreds on her own. So I just wanted to really acknowledge her and appreciate her labor and her time. Tonight's opening session from Lita Jackson, Dismantling Structures of Oppression in New Orleans, will examine the work of dismantling communication that oppresses others. Panelists will explore the work being done in local communities to remove physical representation of hate, such as advocacy work focused on the removal of Confederate monuments in New Orleans. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, the Waterhouse Family Institute for the Study of Communication and Society, which was founded by Dr. Brian Crable, a communication professor at Villanova University. We appreciate Waterhouse's support in creating spaces for dialogue about these important and socially relevant conversations. I would also note that Brian and Waterhouse also are supporting multiple community-centered sessions at NCA. At this time, I'd like to bring Dr. Rochelle Ford, president of Dillard University, to the stage to welcome us all to the city of New Orleans. Dr. Ford is recognized nationally for her work in public relations and conducts research about diversity in advertising and public relations. Prior to her role at Dillard, she served as the dean of the School of Communication at Elon University. Dillard University is a private, historically black university in New Orleans, founded in 1930 and incorporated earlier institutions founded as early as 1869. Dillard University was established to serve as an educational center of excellence in the South. I'd also note that it's the oldest HBCU in New Orleans, in Louisiana. And last night, Dr. Ford, I want to thank her for hosting a reception at Dillard for us. And so connecting to local HBCUs in our convention is something that I hope we continue every convention moving forward. Dr. Ford was elected as president of Dillard just last summer, and great to have a communication representative in that position. So, Dr. Ford, thank you so much.
So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to New Orleans. You know, there's a lot of different ways to pronounce New Orleans, but what I've discovered is folks here say New Orleans, and I used to say New Orleans. Some of you say New Orleans, but you'll upset locals if you say it that way. Nevertheless, it's a pleasure to welcome you all. It's like welcoming family home, because I am a communications scholar. I have been a member of NCA. My institutions have been members of NCA. And so it definitely is welcoming family to my new home here in New Orleans. Dillard University, as you heard, is Louisiana's oldest HBCU. We are also sponsored by both the United Methodist Church and the United Church of Christ, but we are a very proud historically black college. And I wanted to share our mission with you really quickly because I think it's really important for us who are communication scholars. Dillard University is a historically black college that cultivates leaders. Leaders who live ethically, who think and communicate precisely, and who act courageously to make the world a better place. And I think it's important to share that because that centers everything that we do, and I love that we center communication as a key part of what we're striving to make sure all students are able to do. I always tell my students, as I've been teaching in my career, which has been a very long time, that if you can write clearly, if you can speak clearly, it demonstrates that you are thinking clearly. But I also think that if we don't teach our students to live ethically, then they're going to communicate irresponsibly, and we'll end up with additional misinformation and disinformation that causes confusion to democracy. So what we do is critical, because without that, without teaching our students to be leaders and leaders who are bold and act courageously, then our world is really doomed. So I appreciate what you're doing in all your disciplines, from the health communications and the rhetoric to the folks who are doing my discipline at the public relations division. I don't know if any of those PR folks are here, but you know you're my peeps. Yes, thank you. But I also wanted just to give recognition to a couple of folks who have been instrumental to my life and have been very active in NCA over the years. Dr. Melbourne Cummings. Yes, an amazing leader. And also Dr. Carolyn Stroman with Health Communications. And those two women were leaders among leaders when I was an undergraduate at Howard University. And then when I became back to be a professor there, became associate dean, they were bright lights in my life and encouraged me to be a leader. So I just want to publicly just acknowledge them, and also to thank you and to welcome you to New Orleans. Please spend as much money as you'd like. Be prepared to go home with a few extra pounds because we like sauce. Yes, good Creole food. Low on the vegetables, heavy on the seafood, good on the fried. But please enjoy yourselves. And if you'd like to come out to campus, we have an amazing art exhibit that's inside on our campus, and we have been ranked as one of America's most beautiful campuses. So you can see a rich part of New Orleans as well. Enjoy your time here. Welcome to our city.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Sherry Miles Cohen. I am NCA's Executive Director, and I have the pleasure of introducing the panelists From Lee to Jackson, Dismantling Structures of Oppression in New Orleans. And I will introduce the panelists from my left, going to my right. I've got to be very clear about that because I'm directionally challenged. Okay, so to my far left is Dr. David Robinson Morris. Dr. Robinson Morris is the founder and chief reimagilutionary at the Reimagineolution LLC, a strategic consulting firm working at the intersections of imagination, policy, practice, and prophetic hope to radically reimagine diversity, equity, and inclusion toward racial justice and systemic transformation by engendering freedom of the human spirit and catalyzing the power of the imagination to reweave organizations, systems, and the world toward collective healing and liberation. Thank you for being here, Dr. Robinson Morris. To my immediate left is Dr. Roseanne Manzuk. Roseanne is the University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Texas State University, where she has been a member of the faculty since 1987. Roseanne's research focuses on images of women, the rhetorical uses of history, and the construction of public memory in museums and monuments. She has co-authored a scholarly book about the rhetoric of Sojourner Truth, published numerous articles and book chapters examining historical and contemporary rhetoric, and served as editor of Women's Studies in Communication. And of course, you all know that she is the current president of the National Communication Association. Thank you for being here, Roseanne. Immediately to my right is Natonya Listach, who is a master instructor and assistant director of forensics at Middle Tennessee State University. Oh, come on, give her props, you know. Her research interests lie in rhetoric, gender, and instructional communication, with a focus on the rhetoric and pedagogy of Black women. Her most recent publication focuses on the use of womanism in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She is a member of and has presented her work at annual conferences for the National Communication Association. No props for NCA? I'm like, okay. The Organization for the Study of Communication, Language, and Gender, the Religious Communication Association, Southern States Communication Association, and the Tennessee Communication Association. Natonya currently serves as Black Caucus representative for NCA's Idea Council and chair of both the Race and Gender Division and the Rhetoric and Public Address Divisions of TCA. And she also received a 2021 NCA Public Address Division Benson Campbell Dissertation Research Award for her dissertation titled Lifting as We Climb, a Rhetorical Analysis of the Speeches of Hallie Quinn Brown. Immediately to Natonya's left is Brian McCann, who is a cultural critic whose research and teaching interests include Black studies, crime and public culture, critical affect studies, critical prison studies, critical university studies, cultural studies, hip-hop studies, masculinity studies, performativity, rhetorical studies, social movements, and whiteness studies. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in argumentation and debate, social movements, crime and public culture, intersectionality, the politics of citizenship, rhetorical criticism, and social theory. And he also serves as affiliate faculty in African and African American studies, as well as women and gender studies. And to, at the far end of the table, okay. James David Maxon is an assistant professor of teaching in the Department of Communication and Film, and rhetorical and public memory in the American South is his area of expertise. He focuses on how activist communities make use of local resources to transform collective memory in the service of greater justice. And with that, I turn the floor over to Natonya Listach.
Good evening, everyone. Oh, that feels so good. Okay. We have some fantastic panelists up here who have a lot of wonderful things to say, so we're just going to jump on into this. We're going to start on that side, on the far left, and give the panelists a minute, or about 4 or 5 minutes, to give a brief introduction of themselves and their research.
My name, again, is David Robinson Morris. I live here in New Orleans. I'm not a native New Orleanian. I am originally from Galveston, Texas. I am a communications major, PR from Loyola University in New Orleans here, after having 3 majors, but we won't talk about that. In my undergraduate career, I have, my research centers, my academic life centers on the intersection of Ubuntu, which is the South African communalist notion of humanity, and socially engaged Buddhism, right? And how those 2 concepts can come together and help us to rethink higher education and to answer the central question, what does it mean to be a human being, right? And what does it mean for us as humans to understand that humanity is a quality that we owe one another, right? That's my academic work. In my day job, I guess you'd call it, I run a consultancy that brings that work to bear on policy and practice in the city and across the country. Most recently, I was the executive director of a nonprofit called the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society, C-Mind as it was known. I am their last executive director, unfortunately, which tried to infuse higher education with contemplative practices, right? So all of these things come together to help us to rethink and reimagine social relationships, help us to rethink and reimagine policy, practice, how we relate to one another, and again, what it means to be a human being. Here in the city, I serve on a number of boards and committees, and worked at Xavier University of Louisiana for a long time, where I founded the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit there, as well as serving as Assistant Vice President for Development and Assistant Professor in Education. If you know HBCUs, you know you have many jobs. So in addition to fundraiser, also ran this think tank, right, that helps us in this city to reimagine how we've been working, how we've been communicating with one another, and to help us dismantle some of the legacy that is left behind from enslavement, right? You are in one of the most African cities in the country, and I tell people all the time, the air is thick with the ancestors here, right? That means so do right while you're here, because they're always watching. But the air is thick here with the ancestors, and they are asking us to do something different, right? And so my work is to help us to do something different. We'll get into a little bit around the work that I've done with the monuments and with the Streets Renaming Commission on the back end. I served on the research committees for the Streets Renaming Commissions here in the city, and also served as the chair of the now defunct Truth and Reconciliation Committee for the city of New Orleans that was commissioned by the mayor through the Human Relations Commission. That committee was dismantled after I think the mayor realized that once you start talking about truth, reconciliation takes a long time to come, right? And before we can get to the reconciliation, all hell has to break loose, right? And we have to tell the unvarnished truth about what's been happening here and across the country. I'm going to stop there because I can preach all day. And I'm going to...
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Roseanne Manzik, and as you heard in Dr. Mal Cohen's introduction, I've come from the area of rhetorical studies, and much of the research that I've done most recently has been in the area of what's called public memory studies, thinking about how we rhetorically use images of the past, how we tell stories of the past. And that most recently has crossed in my research with trying to understand and help dismantle white supremacy, but from a connection that particularly looks at the intersection of women and white supremacy. And so I'm going to share a little bit of the flavor of that research with you. So take you back to February 22nd, 1911. It was an unseasonably cold day here in the city of New Orleans. Despite what the Times-Picayune described as a raw and chilly weather, distinguished guests and a reported 20,000 onlookers gathered at a city-donated parcel of land at the intersection of Canal and Street and Jefferson Davis Parkway for the unveiling of the highly anticipated monument to Jefferson Davis. The day's festivities began with members of the military, veterans, college students, Boy Scouts, various civic associations parading from the Lee statue to the Davis Memorial ceremony site. Leading the marchers were the governor of Louisiana and the mayor of New Orleans. Arriving at the intersection of Canal Street and Jefferson Davis Parkway, the parade procession was welcomed by 500 schoolgirls who sat on an elevated platform to one side of the monument, dressed in red, white, and blue, and arranged to represent the Confederate flag. To add to the festivities, the school children serenaded guests with renditions of Dixie and America. Now, what a lot of folks don't know is that that particular statue, which was among the 4 that was removed in 2017 here in New Orleans, was largely placed there by a women's organization called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy is the oldest heritage organization in the country. And according to its Louisiana Division website, the organization's general purpose is, quote, to preserve the true history of the Confederacy and keep in sacred memory the brave deeds of the men of the South, with no bitterness toward the government of the United States of America. And UDC has 5 principles: historical, educational, benevolent, memorial, and patriotic. And so recently, of course, as Confederate monuments have become the center of controversy, only occasionally do the commentaries note that the great majority of these Confederate memorials that remain in public squares and in courthouses were placed there in the early 20th century by the UDC. In fact, a recent report of the Southern Poverty Law Center indicates that there are 780 Confederate monuments, specifically the ones at county courthouses, town squares, state capitals, and other public venues. And significantly, 604 of those were dedicated prior to 1950, and 411 of the monuments at courthouses and other conspicuous locations were funded by the UDC. So the UDC assumed this important leading role in promoting and substantiating the particular mythic ideology of the lost cause through commemoration. And the rhetorical legacy strategically combines traditional gender ideologies with the constructed memory of a mythic South in their commemorative practice. So in seeking to preserve the South heritage, the daughters essentially extended, quote, the vestal flame of piety lighted up by heaven in the breast of woman, to erect these devout beacons of public remembrance. So what I argue in this research, importantly, is rendering and remembering that conservation is a feminine activity that's motivated by this kind of deference and traditional femininity, is actually a really dangerous rhetorical mask, right, that obscures the complex and objectionable realities of the racist oppression that monuments materially evoke. Moreover, the evocation of traditional feminine roles in concert with the politics of racism yields a potent rhetorical reservoir that continues to be accessed by women who participate in the politics of white supremacy. So in my research, I try to look at that potent intersection of gender and power and racism.
Hey everyone. Thanks for making it. I know it's been a long day. Again, I'm Brian McCann at Louisiana State University. To start off, I wanted to thank Waleed and the rest of the convention planners for the opportunity for this discussion. I'm a Louisiana resident myself, and I'm thrilled that we are taking time to dwell on the nuances of this fraught and fabulous place. The description for this panel and the conference program promises a discussion about the work of dismantling communication that oppresses others. It urges presenters and audience members to engage the work being done in local communities to remove physical representations of hate. For many of us, the presence of a white supremacist monument is intuitive enough. If it is a statue of someone who owned slaves and/or fought for people's right to own slaves, we can comfortably say it is a white supremacist monument. But the occasion of this panel draws me to Ursula Orr's work on lynching. She describes how violent anti-blackness circulates as a ritualized rhetorical form. For her, extrajudicial public executions of black people are not the only examples of lynching in U.S. civil society, but one especially depraved iteration of a patterned rhetorical performance. Drawing from Orr's work, I want to urge a broadening of what we mean when speaking of physical representations of hate. As many of our colleagues in performance and rhetorical studies demonstrate, presence is an effect. A commitment to presence conceptualized in a robust, dare I say abolitionist, critique of white supremacy enables us to detect such symbols all around us. New Orleans is a city laden with monuments to white supremacy that, like the regal structures of lost cause ideology, participate in the erasure of the Crescent City's blackness. Such monuments include jails, decrepit levees, private police forces protecting white property and tourism revenue in the French Quarter, Airbnbs in historically black neighborhoods, the haunting remains of Charity Hospital, trendy restaurants, drunk tourists posing more of a threat to public safety than an army of constantly surveilled unhoused people, majority white wedding parties commissioning second lines, and convention hotels from whose swanky rooms the city's majority black working class and poor appear microscopic and therefore irrelevant to even the most cosmopolitan among us. To paraphrase recent text from the nearby Joy Theater's conspicuous marquee, virtually everything we love about New Orleans comes from the collective genius of black people. But even as so many forces in the city extract value from blackness, it does so in ways that seek to erase it and replace it with simulacra. How will NCA occupy space in New Orleans this week? Will we devise ways to experience it differently? Will we co-conspire with the city's workers, homeless, drug addicts, sex workers, criminals, and others, to honor a place that hides in plain sight? And will we have the humility to understand why they may not want us to stand too close? Or will we proceed in ways that comply with the anti-black erasure of so many monuments where we sleep, dine, and sow our wild oats? We are, after all, a field enamored with monuments, whether they be distinguished scholars, intellectual canons, or notions of rigor. And we have declined ample opportunity in the past to honor place through solidarity with hotel workers, queer and trans people, and others for whom our presence and our monuments have distinctly material consequences, often because we have chosen the esteem of our monuments over the bodies and communities of others. Are we willing to risk their destruction? Would we let them crumble if doing so was a precondition for a more just future? Can we imagine place differently in ways that look beyond the allure of idols and toward new ways of thinking and being together? Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Maxon at the University of Memphis. I want to extend my thanks to everyone who put this panel together and my esteemed panelists who I get to share the stage with. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. My research largely focuses on the ways that activists in New Orleans and throughout the American South more generally have resisted the naturalization of whiteness and white supremacy in the material landscape. So in particular, I've looked into the ways that activists use local memorial traditions to resist the erasure of Black and Indigenous histories from public space and also from public memory. And like much of the United States, well, New Orleans is often thought of as its own thing, but it also does share quite a bit in common with the rest of the United States. New Orleans is saturated with symbols of white supremacy, as we've heard already, and as you've probably noticed. A handful of the most ostentatious Confederate monuments were removed just a few short years ago in 2017. However, there are still street names and school names and statues, just to name a few, that continue to work together to create an environment where heroic colonial histories feel commonplace, their perspectives taken for granted because of both their ubiquity in public space and the institutional authority that undergirds them. Now, in such an environment, histories that don't foreground the project of whiteness are all too often relegated to the margins, pushed aside. So as scholars of public memory are quick to point out, what we remember and what we revere is always a source of contestation and competition. And significantly, histories, memories, and traditions that resist the legacy of white supremacy in New Orleans are close at hand. They may have been decentered in popular discourse and memory, but they certainly are not gone. Therefore, considering the collective resources available to communities like New Orleans is an important way of understanding how memorial structures that create, enforce, and circulate oppressive regimes of memory can themselves be resisted and replaced. So, for example, Black New Orleanian communities have rich traditions for animating shared pasts for the benefit of the living. One such tradition is the jazz funeral, and you can see it depicted artistically up in the top right there, the statue that you can find in Armstrong Square. In overly simple terms, a jazz funeral is a musical procession where a brass band plays dirges mourning the departed on the way to the cemetery, and at a predetermined moment, historically when the body is laid to rest, the band cuts the body loose and switches to upbeat celebratory music. The mourners and those who showed up just for the music honor the life of the deceased and make manifest a community that will persist in the aftermath of loss. At their core, jazz funerals are musical traditions developed and sustained by New Orleans black communities, though they've been embraced by others in New Orleans and abroad, often in a much thinner capacity. Jazz funerals are sonic and bodily expressions of community, continuity, memory, and a reclamation of public space. As such, jazz funerals and the related second line parades have been used to protest monuments to white supremacy, as the activist group Take 'Em Down NOLA did in 2017, and I was able to take part in that. They've been used to process widespread trauma, as has happened frequently since 2005 to mark anniversaries of the levees that failed following Hurricane Katrina, and Dillard University hosted a jazz funeral for Katrina in 2015. They've also been used to recover nearly lost black histories, as occurred in 1996 with the mock jazz funeral for jazz pioneer Buddy Bolden. The tradition of using mock funerals as a form of public civic expression predates jazz itself in New Orleans. For example, there was a 2-day funeral celebrating the death of American slavery that was held in 1865, just 2 months before the end of the Civil War. In other words, jazz funerals and mock funerals are memorial traditions that are more flexible than stone and are deeply rooted in the performances and experiences of Black New Orleanians. It adapts to meet the needs of the present. It sonically marks space, people, and events, identifying them as worthy of incorporation into living traditions of memory. And jazz funerals resist the erasure and omissions of white supremacist histories by calling absences to the forefront and reanimating them. So what is one thing that we can learn while we congregate here in New Orleans for NCA, along with the questions that we've heard from Brian and from others? I think one thing that we can work on is attentiveness to active traditions of memory that create opportunities for all of us to learn how to dismantle structures of oppression with our own tools in the places that we call home. Thank you.
So we have a few questions that are preset that we wanted to discuss with the panelists. This one has been addressed a little bit by the panelists already, but I wanted to see if anyone might want to add anything to what you said. New Orleans has a multicultural and multivaried set of influences, and honoring place is layered by different people's experiences, influences, and consequences in American history. And how does your research collectively give voice to these issues? And I will open the floor up to whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll pop in. So I can finish the story of the Jefferson Davis Monument, right? As several of us have said, that's one of the ones that was taken down in 2017. Notably, right, many of you may have recall this from the news reports and from a recent documentary film, if you've seen it, that it was those monuments were taken down on the cover of darkness. In the case of the Jefferson Davis Memorial at 3 a.m., and with workers whose identities were masked and their identities were hidden for fear of violence against them and retribution against them from those who protested the monuments being taken down. And so I think for me, the research not only into sort of women's roles, right, in that intersection of monuments and memory and white supremacy, but the ways that we contest, right, as David said, that we contest the memory in our communities, and that is a site for struggle, and that struggle hasn't ended, right? It doesn't end when the monuments go down, and the question remains of what do we do next, right? Because there are street names, and there are schools, as Brian mentioned, and there are so many more pieces of the legacy, as well as the economic divisions and the legacies of all kinds of segregation practices. So I think trying to, for me, from a kind of rhetorical and historical perspective, it's understanding where that comes from to understand then how do we intervene in where we find the intersections. And that's what motivates me to do this kind of work.
you know, I think about Christina Sharp's work in the Wake on being in blackness, right? And one of my favorite passages from that piece, she talks about, and I'm going to read it because I don't want to get it wrong. She says, 500 years of slavery have scattered people of African descent all over the world. A dispersal enacted on us not as workers, adventurers, or bureaucrats, but as things. The story of how these stolen people became commodities, then became black people, and survived as such is breathtaking and strange. How can this inexpressible loss be expressed in language, she asks. How can it be expressed in language? Oftentimes it can't, right? In this city, the expression is its culture. The expression is its art. The expression is its music. The expression is its joy. The expression is when you walk by someone, you say good morning and hello because they are not stones, they're human beings. That's the expression, right? We have lots of these conferences come to town, and folks take this view of, well, I want to study what's going on here. Right? As a person who's lived here since college, which is 20 plus years, right? We don't study the condition of the city, we live it. Right? We live joy, we breathe into that because it is so much suffering, right? Now we also talk about, you know, dismantling, and we often bring in those words of white supremacy and oppression and all of those things, and we always want to talk about dismantling structures, right? But the real issue is that, unfortunately, some white folks have not dismantled themselves. So we can't get into structures until you deal with your shit, pardon my French. Right? It's difficult to talk about the monuments without talking about the people who placed them there and what they were trying to uphold. It's difficult to talk about the monuments and not talk about the people who walk by them every day who look like me and ignore them because they don't mean a damn thing. We know how we live, we know where we live, we know who we are. We are the people of humanity's birth, and without us, none of you would be here. So when you know who you are, and there are folks in this town who know who they are, all the music, all the dancing, all the singing, all the celebration, all the arts and culture, those are prayers. Everything becomes a prayer. And as one of those people, as a person of the global majority, I may not know why I'm suffering, but I know the suffering will come to an end, and I know that I will make it so come hell or high water. But what I can't do, because they cannot hear me, I cannot change the hearts of white folks who keep these systems in place. You got to do that work yourself. So we can have this conversation about monuments, we can have this conversation about economics, we can have this conversation about power, we can have this conversation about all of those things, about educational systems. But I think white folks need to get in a room and talk to themselves about why you are acting this way. Why do you need to uphold these systems? What's that beautiful quote from Toni Morrison on Charlie Rose? You know, for you to be big, do I have to be on my knees? Now, if that's the case, you got a serious problem.
One thing that's coming to mind for me is in one of our first collaborations, my co-author Ashley Mack and I, we wrote a piece about a public shooting in a historically black part of New Orleans that was basically ignored nationally. And in the process of writing that, we lived in New Orleans at the time, and at one point there was a pretty large, I mean, it wasn't a mass shooting, but there was a shooting in the French Quarter. that made some national news, and we reliably had family and friends like texting us to make sure we were okay. We lived like 10 minutes from the French Quarter, so like, yes, we were fine. And then a couple days after that, our neighbor, like literally our neighbor, 2 doors down from us, was shot point blank in the head in his house, a black man in his 50s. And we didn't get any reach out from family and friends because it didn't make New Orleans news, let alone national news. And I think for a lot of white folks, particularly outside of Louisiana, New Orleans is the French Quarter. That's it. I mean, it took a few years for me to even be coming here, let alone then living here, to venture outside of the Quarter, where the vast majority of the city's population lives, in part because they work in the French Quarter but cannot afford to live in the French Quarter. So I think just having a bigger sense of the city itself, and I think this holds true for a lot of cities, is a precondition of doing the kind of work that David's talking about.
Thanks for all these responses. In the research that I started doing initially, because I lived in New Orleans for a year and was completely enamored with the place, and the sense that history was around us, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what that was exactly, but I could feel it. And then starting to pay attention to the ways that some histories are commodified and taken outside of their original meaning, whatever that is, and used to be sold to strangers, to create a sense, a feeling of place that wasn't really anchored in anything in particular. And so initially, in trying to figure that out, I was like, oh, we just got to kind of claw that away and find the truth somewhere here. But what you find in a place like New Orleans is that histories are sedimented on top of each other in the same places. And as you pull out one, it reveals another. And it's hard to come to some specific truth in whatever you're researching. But you end up finding something where different histories are talking back to each other or talking past each other or representing some sort of unspeakable violence or trauma. But part of the work of thinking about memory in a place like this is getting to understand whose memories are foregrounded, whose memories allow some communities to walk around, see the histories that they're taught, physically manifest, and feel certain in who they are, and which communities are not afforded those opportunities. And so that's one of the things that I think about with regard to New Orleans is the richness of the layering of history and the difficult work of not just kind of peeling it back to find the truth, but to understand how these competing histories work against, with, across each other.
Kind of tying into what you were saying, our next question, New Orleans is a black city. How does the white power structure still have such a strong influence on the area? Where is the power, and how does it tie into the narratives of community and place? Whoever wants to go.
Well, I'll start out again. It sounds like I'm the only one here on the program that has not lived here. But I've had the opportunity, largely as a tourist, to visit many times. And so in thinking about this question and doing some reading about it, I came across some pretty sobering studies about the economic disparities and the racial segregation that was created and sustained in New Orleans through decades of federal and state and local policy. So just want to talk about that a little bit. So that you had, before the Civil War, you had black residents living in every ward in New Orleans. But after the war, you had, as in many cities, and David and I were chatting about my hometown of Austin, for example, you had exclusionary zoning, the redlining, the neighborhood covenants, the Jim Crow laws that kept white residents and black residents apart. And so the impact's been a long-standing segregation and a series of mechanisms, right, that has kept that white structure and the right interests and power. And I think in particular, when you think about real estate and you think about the redlining and those segregation practices, you have to also then think about who benefits from continuing those structures, and the benefits, of course, go to the folks that are interested in gentrification, the folks that are then, we're seeing same thing again in Austin, where I come from, seeing the moving into taking over historic black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods, and that is all fine and good for the image of the city, but not for the communities, right, that are being continually displaced. So I think it's a big economic question in terms of that white power still being there, even though you have the majority in the city.
Yeah, I'll follow up with some of those stats, right? So we're 59% African American, we're 6% Hispanic, 3% Asian, 31% white, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. We are a majority minority city. Yet, median income for African American households is $25,000 a year, compared to $65,000 a year for white households. Right? African American workers are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than white workers. A full 71% of African American households are liquid asset poor. Right? That means that they lack the savings necessary to live above the poverty level for just 3 months if they lose their job or have an emergency. Right? Only 43% of African American households and 33% of Latino households own their homes, which is a major sign of generational wealth, compared to 54% of white or Asian households. It's been said before, but it's unfortunate to have to say again that we live in a sharecropper town, right? The plantation economy is alive and well in New Orleans and in the South in general. And it is readily felt in the economics, in the bifurcation between the haves and the have-nots, right? Between who is serving and who is being served. We feel it every day. Now we can talk about the causes of that, right? Let's talk about the educational system here in the state. Poor, right? Let's talk about it's so bad because a number of folks who don't look like me send their children to private schools and have divested from public education. Let's talk about New Orleans being a majority charter city, right? Run by majority white-run CMOs, charter management operations. This isn't a surprise. It's not happenstance. It just didn't, this is set up. This is set up. I had the privilege, I've had lots of jobs. I had the privilege of one job to work at a private school here in town. Average tuition, $26,000 a year. I also worked at a charter management operation as their director of development for a year. The way the curriculum is structured, the pedagogical approaches are completely different. At this very expensive private school, I was teaching a class once and the student got up and went to the restroom. Well, if you went to public school, you know that's a no-no. Right? And I said, where are you going? Sit down. I have to use the restroom. I said, did you ask? I don't have to ask permission to use the restroom. That's a bodily function. Right? And I said, if you don't sit your ass down, and ask me to use the restroom. But there was such a difference But that's one small example of the approach, right? They were teaching their students how to lead, how to think critically, how not to color inside the lines, right? How not to walk in straight lines. When the public schools, color inside the line, ask permission to use the restroom, raise your hand, right? We know they're training grounds for prisons, right? These things don't happen by chance. All of this is a setup. Now, what do you do about the setup? How do you scramble it? How do you mess it up, right? How do you get into it? And I forgot what the question was because I'm in my head at the moment. How do you sustain the white power? That's how the power structure is sustained, right? We can look at education, we can look at economics, right? We can look at the prison industrial complex, and we can even look at the nonprofit industrial complex, which is doing its own work to sustain white power structures, right? So the question for me is, how do we wake people up to this, right? And how do we get people to think outside of what's already been thought, to think something different? It doesn't have to be this way. It literally doesn't. But it's hard work to think outside of what's already here, right? I'll stop there because my brain's gone. Go ahead.
I was going to hop in to add to the list, right? When I drove into New Orleans today from Memphis, came down I-55 and then on I-10 towards the central business district, and it's a reminder that when I-10 was built, originally it was going to come through the French Quarter. It was going to cut along the river. It was going to separate the French Quarter from the river. And residents in the French Quarter rallied together and made the French Quarter a historic district to resist I-10 from coming through their neighborhood. And so the solution to allow people who had moved out of the city to be able to commute back into the city to get to the central business district was to put I-10 straight over Claiborne Avenue, which is still there underneath I-10. And Claiborne Avenue, you probably know where this is going, was a thriving neighborhood in the middle of the Treme, filled with black-owned businesses and homes that were demolished. If you look at archival footage, right, or photos of Claiborne, majestic oak trees that we now associate with St. Charles Avenue or Napoleon or Carrollton, these places along parade routes that you see during Mardi Gras, just as beautiful rows of oak trees that were just bulldozed to make way for I-10. And so if you go along Claiborne now, you'll notice that the businesses are not thriving. The community is struggling in a big way. The cacophony of sound of the cars driving over, literally bypassing the heart of the city. Some of the pillars have been painted to resemble oak trees. And there are beautiful murals. There are ways that even in the midst of this, the kind of devastation, that reclamation of that space has happened. So you still have Mardi Gras Indians and brass bands congregating under Claiborne, and they've developed ways of pointing their instruments up to create this amplification of sound that you don't get in the open air space. But it's still a reminder of a forced resilience, a resilience that was, and we might come back to this later, a resilience that was forced upon a community that was not necessary. And then, of course, Hurricane Katrina came along in 2005. The levees did not function the way they were supposed to. They flooded the city, and the disproportionate impact was felt in black communities, in neighborhoods like you've heard of, the Ninth Ward, but then also New Orleans East and Gentilly. And the money that was given from the federal government to help reconstruct these homes was based on property values. And since the property values in black neighborhoods were, the houses were undervalued, they received less money to rebuild their homes and often weren't given enough to fully rebuild their houses to be habitable once more. And so there's these histories as well that continue to privilege white structures of white people in power.
I think when considering New Orleans, it's, and actually I think, I lived in Austin for a few years myself, so it comes to mind there too, but New Orleans is located in Louisiana, and that's really relevant, right? And I mean, as a resident of Louisiana, I believe the whole state is, entitled to nuance, right? It's a complicated place generally. And also in a lot of ways, it's a neo-Confederate hellscape. I mean, that's just kind of what it is. And I think there's a couple things there, right? I mean, I think there's a country-city divide, right, which prevails in a lot of states, right? There is a lot of resentment toward New Orleans from more conservative, predominantly white areas. And then also crucially, I think it was David who mentioned mass incarceration. Overwhelmingly the parish that is the most heavily incarcerated, specifically at Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, is people from Orleans Parish, right? Specifically black men from Orleans Parish. And if you know much about the carceral system, you know that is really bad for New Orleans political power on a statewide and national level, really good for the rural areas by the Tunica Hills, because prisoners get counted where they're physically at for political purposes, not where they're originally from. So mass incarceration is quite literally extracting political power, not to mention living, breathing human beings who are loved in parts of their community from here. And then also, I mean, there's the Orleans Parish Prison, which is a whole other conversation too. But I mean, both the jailing and the prison system here have a huge impact on, I think, why New Orleans blackness historically does not always translate into actual political and economic power for black people.
So once again, thinking of the title of this, Dismantling Structures of Oppression in New Orleans, how does this layered community express itself in gendered relationships, and how has that changed throughout history? I'm going to call on this side since y'all haven't started yet.
I mean, and this is going to be probably like borderline incoherent, but one thing that is coming to mind though is and I think this gets forgotten about the South in general, but a few years ago I did an interview with some core members of a group called Breakout, and it appeared in QED, which is Chuck Morris and Tom Nakayama's journal, and I mean, it's worth checking out. But Breakout is an organization of queer and trans youth of color who are fighting the criminalization of themselves, and so, I mean, I think that question is important to be kind of viewed at the grassroots for one thing, right? That, I think the people who live here, thrive here, and suffer here are doing a lot of that kind of organizing work around questions of gender and sexuality at the intersections of race and class, too. So, I mean, for Breakout, it's not distinct, right? I mean, they're, intersectionality 101, they can't decide to be queer and trans one day and black another. I mean, I think New Orleans, at least in my experience, in Louisiana in general, and this is true of probably any place, but I do think there's some queerness and gender transgression baked in a lot of ways. I mean, Mardi Gras is, for all the ways it's been kind of mass-produced, commercialized, and has become problematic in a million ways, right, is a space where people get to be transgressive, right, and where some of that takes place. But then also the statewide question too, because we're the only deep southern state with a Democratic governor, but he's still militantly anti-choice, right? So, abortion is illegal in Louisiana, and that's going to disproportionately impact women of color and black women specifically. So, yeah, that was what came to mind.
Thanks, Brian. I was thinking about the historical aspect of this question and the way that women are often used as rhetorical props to enforce violent agendas. And so the protection of white women, for instance, used as one of the central pillars to justify white supremacist action. And we can connect this back to the questions of the mass incarceration and whatnot, over-policing, and those sorts of things. And I would like to hear some more about how that ties in with the histories of the monuments as well. But this sort of discourse of gender normativity, of protecting whiteness, protecting white femininity in particular, becomes ways of reading a place like New Orleans with its demographics as dangerous or unsafe. And that has lasting implications on both on an individual level, how you perceive the place that you are. It has, and it certainly echoes out into issues of policy. So it becomes justifications for regressive laws to be passed at the state level or the federal level, which continue to amplify some of the violent problems that white supremacy poses in a place like New Orleans.
A couple of more things about the gendered aspect. A few things come to mind. Certainly, I think that the point about using the white femininity and the rhetoric of protection is one way, again, to have a mask, right, that then does justify those policies. But it's interesting another way to think about when we think about even the structures of memory and monuments. One of the things that I did was look to see, are there monuments to women in the city? And there are a few, but not many. One is the Joni, I guess it's called Joni on a Pony, the Joan of Arc statue, which isn't linked to this history at all, right? There is the Mahalia Jackson Music Center in Louis Armstrong Park. There is is it Marie Laveau? Is that how you say her name? Yeah, which brings in a whole different kind of gendered Black femininity that's very limited. The voodoo, her gravesite is listed among the memorials. So it's just a handful. And so it's very interesting to me, again, to come back to thinking about how white women not only serve in that protective discourse as the substance or the symbol that then allows for those restrictive policies and practices to go forward, but they also practice that. Right. So again, a group like historically the United Daughters of the Confederacy would say, well, we are protecting the memories. It's our job as women to be stewards of the past. And so we're not political. We're not racist. We're just honoring our ancestors. And so I think that protective discourse when it crosses with gender is a particularly insidious and powerful kind of discourse that gets marshaled in different ways.
Yeah, a group of friends and I got together and we had a conversation. Somebody asked if we were midterm elections, right? We're looking at voting and how that turned out in midterm elections. And the question was, what's going on with white women? What is going on with them? Why are they voting in this way? And my theory was not only about the protection of white supremacist patriarchy, but that literally white women birthed into the world, literally, right? And if you think about mothers who birth a child into the world, they want the world for their child. And so we're having this conversation and they were like, no, that is crazy. And I was like, well, think about it. Why else would you protect this thing that doesn't protect you if it's not for your future? If it's not because you literally birth white men into the world and you want them to rule it, because then they in turn protect you, right? So this question, not much has changed. Unfortunately, not much has changed. In the city, right, we are a dot of blue in a sea of red. And this city has always been a live and let live city, right? There always been I want to say they have always been folks who have transgressed gender lines, who have celebrated their queerness, right? We are a city that is becoming more and more known for being open and welcome. But it doesn't mean that there aren't lots and lots of issues. I serve on way too many boards and committees, but I serve as the PAC chair for the Human Rights Campaign for the state of Louisiana, and also the vice president of the Forum for Equality Foundation, both working on these issues. And what we know is that the violence against genderqueer people in the city of New Orleans is outrageous. It's outrageous. And a number of it, well, I should say this lightly, right? It's being done by law enforcement. Yep. Now I have to get home tonight, so if something happens to me, you know what happened. But these are the issues that we're dealing with. It is still a city that is very gendered. We have our first black woman mayor who's catching all kinds of hell, not saying it's not, she doesn't deserve it, but a lot of things are happening because of who she is. Right? A lot of the things that are being raised are being raised because of that reason. But this is a city controlled by men and controlled by white men, even by the black men who think they control it, right? So those dynamics haven't gone away. They've not gone away. We are still a city in the South who likes to play into that myth of Southern womanhood and Southern manhood and chivalry and all of that stuff, right? And I was going to say something really rude, but I'll leave it there.
And I will just add that playing into that myth, if New Orleans is one tourist location in Louisiana, we can't forget that nearby are the plantations, right? And so there is the Southern Belle and the reinforcement of the lost cause and the myth all wrapped into a nice tourist package, right, to complement the other.
Well, we've also wanted to address the environment. New Orleans is constantly hit with hurricanes, and how does climate change affect planning for the life of the city and the future of the city? What is the intersection between the multicultural nature of the city and climate change?
Well, I'll hop in. Not being from here, it was a very interesting process for me to think about how have others answered that question. And so, of course, people that study the intersection between climate change and racism note that there is a stark divide, right, between who's caused climate change and who is suffering from climate change. And across the world, that is true. But of course, you mentioned Hurricane Katrina. I mean, that was very much true here, that the climate justice movement points out that it is, the exploitation of natural resources and the current issues that environmental justice brings to the forefront, that points out that it's the people who get the worst food and the worst health care and the worst treatment, and then, historically, then when freed, were given lands that eventually were surrounded by things like petrochemical plants and low-lying areas that are subject to flooding. And so the cycle goes back so far in terms of the devastation of climate change on those economically suppressed and culturally suppressed neighborhoods, right?
Yeah, it's, again, one of those committees that I serve on is the Equity Advisory Committee for the Governor's Climate Initiative. I don't actually work. I just serve on committees. That's what I'm figuring out. What strikes me is that we did a lot of work across the state around Cancer Alley, right? Sharon Levine, if you don't know Sharon Levine, Miss Sharon is sort of the warrior who's down in St. James Parish, and she runs an organization called Rise St. James. She is a black woman who grew up in St. James Parish. Her people are buried in the land owned by the chemical companies. And what we see are these devastating impacts to health, right? We see increased asthma rates, we see cancer rates that are high in these areas, we see all of these things that are impacting the actual lives of people. Then we take it all the way back to Katrina, right? So after Katrina, I worked as the senior publicist for the mayor of New Orleans, covering all of those areas critical to the rebuilding. I was 22 years old and had no clue what I was doing and should not have been in that position, but I was there. And I got to see in a number of those meetings how those conversations were being handled, right? Now, you may remember Mayor Nagin, who's the mayor who said New Orleans will always be a chocolate city. That mayor, that was not the speech I wrote for MLK Day, by the way. Although he folded it up and put it in his top pocket, I was like, oh, hell, we're in trouble. But what he was trying to say in those meetings, there were concerted efforts to lock people out of their city. Right? We remember during Katrina that folks were bused to different cities, they were taken to convention centers, and there was an effort. We called it the green dot map, if you remember this, to say this land that housed people for half a century is now going to be a public park. Can't come home. We're taking your land by eminent domain. You will get nothing for it. This is a park. And it was all of the low-lying black neighborhoods. If you remember that mayor, you should remember his mouth. And he had lots of choice words to say in those meetings about this plan. But what it showed all of us was that we had to fight extra hard in the media, right, to get the narrative out that folks wanted to come back home, deserved to come back home, and actually shutting them out of their homes was a travesty, right? And that it was un-American. And Americans don't like being called un-American, right? That's a key. Call somebody un-American, they'll do whatever they need to do, right? But those conversations are still going on, right? We just had Hurricane Ida, where the city was without power for 21 days. 21 days. People scattered. And these are poor people who don't have the resources to stay at the Battle House in Mobile like I did for 21 days with my puppy, which was not fun. Right? These things they impact the everyday lives of folks, right? It's going to take some of those folks a year to recover financially from Ida. But we also you talked about the levee systems, right? You talked about how all of those things are set up. And they are weakest in black and poor neighborhoods.
Another thing, when we think about climate change and hurricanes and the effect that they have, talk to New Orleanians who experienced Hurricane Katrina. They'll tell you this was not a natural disaster. The hurricane came through. The city dealt with the hurricane. And then the levees failed, and that's when the catastrophe happened, right? So there can be a way, if you're looking at it from afar. I lived in Missouri at the time, and I remember people looking at, like, watching what was happening on the news, and the discourse was like, well, why would you go back? You know, you're just going to get hit by another hurricane. It's going to happen anyway. Why don't you just go? And that lens, well, there's a couple of things going on, right? Or there's more than a couple of things going on. One of the things that's going on is a perception that what happens to New Orleans is natural and therefore unavoidable. And climate change, as we've just been talking about, as you all know, it's not natural. And it is disproportionately impacting places like New Orleans. We can't absolve ourselves of guilt and step away and just be like, oh, you know, a storm's going to happen. It's tough. Another thing that's happening in that perspective of why don't I just leave, is a sense that New Orleans is not America, that New Orleans is its own kind of separate place, and the response of the federal government to Hurricane Katrina was to send in troops and to lock the city down before the humanitarian response, right? So there is the otherness that is placed on the city also fuels the risks of climate change or hurricanes that come through. So I guess just to circle back in case I wasn't clear, these are human-made catastrophes and things that could be avoided.
Just anecdotally, this is reminding me a few years ago, and I was living in New Orleans. I was sharing a cab with somebody in New York on the way to my hotel or whatever from the airport, and he asked where I was from, and I said New Orleans, and I'll never forget. He said, "I didn't realize people actually lived in New Orleans." It was just like to him, it was this tourist kind of fun place, but like the notion that people live there was like surprising to him, and it was we were together for a bit, so I decided not to pick a fight, but no, I guess right before the panel, the three of us were discussing how so often there's kind of this rhetorical move when one brings up, not always, but often when one brings up the environment, particularly when white folks bring up the environment, where it becomes this pivot away from race. Right, because the environment can get framed in this kind of like universal terms, like, oh, we're all at risk, and on maybe some very general existential level that's true, but as we kind of established, those impacts are not divided equally. So I think one thing is, if it's going to be an environmental discourse, it needs to be an anti-racist discourse as well, or otherwise it's often descends into this really kind of facile lifestyle politics, at least in my experience. But the second thing is, and this is, I don't know, this is maybe on the abstract side, but I've had this conversation a lot over the past few months about what a liberating thing pessimism can be sometimes, right? And because it kind of takes the status quo off the table in a lot of ways, right? And I think there's something to that when it comes to environmental catastrophe, where it just presents so, undebatably that the way you all have done it has not worked, right? So how do we divest? How do we imagine new ways of being, new ways of organizing? So, whose futures are we thinking about, right? Is a future in the context of climate change, an attempt to make the present more adaptable to the future, or is it an attempt to build something in the shell of the old that's radically new and alternative? And it's hard to turn that into like a ballot measure or even a social movement, but kind of as a guiding telos, I think there's something there, and environmental matters, I think, particularly those matters here, present that kind of opportunity.
So we only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to leave us on this question, and we're going to start on this side so we can go down that way. How do we, as scholars of communication, contribute to constructing the narrative of cultural dominance?
I got into communication because I was fascinated with the ability of storytellers to tell good stories. And that continues to be a through line in the sort of work that I do as a teacher, as a scholar, as someone who has opportunities to sit in front of generous audiences and speak. And so one of the roles that I think that we as a discipline, one of our responsibilities that we have as a discipline has, is to look at the idols, to look at the monuments, and to be able to critique them without fear, with bravery and with courage. But it's also to look to the experiences that have not been foregrounded, look to the ways of being that can offer us something new and hopeful, and figure out ways that we can share those stories, either by amplifying voices or by joining the chorus ourselves. So I fear that's a rather abstract response to the question, but that's the approach that I find myself most hopeful for.
So, yeah, in terms of how communication scholars contribute to the narrative of domination, right? That was yeah. I mean, I think part of that is presuming that we are authoring a narrative of liberation, because usually we're not. I think people living in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans are authoring a narrative of liberation, and it's our job to learn from that and then, as David's saying, amplify that.
Well, and I would say that perhaps we shouldn't contribute to right, a dominant narrative. I think we often do perpetuate right, ways of thinking and of those dominant narratives, but I think that perhaps the way to think about it is that it's a multiplicity of stories, and that we have to honor that there are multiple perspectives and not seek a unifying story, because there isn't one, right? But maybe we can start conversations around where those multiple stories intersect in profitable ways.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. It's about lifting up the multiple narratives, right? Calling out the intersections of those narratives, dismantling the grand narrative that is a myth in and of itself, right? The question for communications professionals is, how do you tell the story that is complex, that is multi-layered, that has multiple truths, but tell it in a way that is simple on the other side of complex, right, which is the hardest place to get to. How do we tell it that way, right? This notion of domination, I love the point about liberation, right? The liberation is the practice of love, justice, right? So how do you practice love, justice in your speech and in your communication? How do you acknowledge the multiple truths? How do you acknowledge the multiple identities? How do you acknowledge the intersections, right? How do you trouble the dialogue? That's the key, right? Now, what I learned in communications was clear, concise, right? Keep it simple, keep it third grade. That's not gonna work. That's how we got here, right? You can still keep it third grade and shake some tables. I know some third graders who can shake tables with their vocabulary, right? But I think that's where we have to go, right? Releasing the need for a dominant narrative.
Didn't know if you wanted to close it or if you wanted to. Okay. Well, let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you all for coming, and we want to once again thank the Waterhouse Family Institute for sponsoring this session.